In the early summer of 1940, Benito Mussolini stood before the world and declared the Mediterranean Sea to be Mare Nostrum, our sea. To the casual observer, the Regia Marina, the Italian Royal Navy, looked like a modern Titan. It possessed sleek, fast battleships, elegant cruisers, and one of the largest submarine fleets on the planet. But behind the Roman salutes and the gleaming hull paint, there was a terrifying vacuum of resources. Italy, unlike Britain or Germany, lacked the coal, the steel, and the oil to sustain a prolonged industrial war. The grand illusion was born out of necessity. Mussolini knew that he could not outbuild the British Empire in a fair fight, so he turned to a weapon as old as Rome itself: deception. He needed to convince the British Admiralty that every Italian harbor was a fortress and every shadow on the water was a heavy cruiser. This was the beginning of the cardboard fleet, a strategy where wood, canvas, and paint were used to fill the gaps where steel should have been. As the war began, the Italian engineers were ordered to become magicians, creating a phantom navy that would haunt the British reconnaissance pilots and force the Royal Navy to waste precious fuel, chasing ghosts across the Mediterranean. The psychological foundation of the Italian deception was brilliant in its simplicity. They understood that in modern aerial warfare, the camera lens was the primary weapon of the enemy. If you could fool the lens, you could fool the admiral. The Italian High Command recruited artists, set designers from Rome's film industry, and specialized engineers to create simulacri, highly detailed decoys. These weren't just simple wooden boxes, they were masterpieces of camouflage. From 5,000 feet up, a plywood frame covered in painted canvas looked exactly like the Littorio-class battleship. They even used smudge pots to create artificial smoke, making it appear as if these wooden giants were warming their boilers for a sortie. The goal was to freeze the British fleet in place. By making the British believe the Italian Navy was concentrated in certain ports, they forced the Royal Navy to maintain expensive and dangerous blockades. It was a war of nerves, where the stakes were the survival of an empire. For the Italian sailor on a real ship, these decoys were a source of dark humor, but for the British pilots flying through anti-aircraft fire to photograph these harbors, the cardboard fleet was a mystery that would take years to fully unravel. Taranto was the crown jewel of the Italian naval presence, a base so vital that the British were obsessed with its destruction. To protect the real fleet, the Italians transformed the surrounding coastline into a theater of shadows. They built entire dummy docks and artificial shorelines miles away from the actual naval installations. These decoy ports were equipped with fake lights at night, timed to mimic the activity of a bustling military harbor. When British bombers arrived, they were often greeted by a meticulously staged performance. The Italians would set fire to piles of oil-soaked rags near the decoys to simulate hits, leading the British pilots to report successful missions against targets that didn't exist. This was a sophisticated game of cat and mouse. The British reconnaissance units, known as the Med-Air Reconnaissance Intelligence, would spend hours analyzing shadows and wave patterns, trying to distinguish between a steel hull and a wooden frame. The Italians even went so far as to move the decoys periodically, using small tugboats to change their positions within the fake harbor to simulate a fleet that was active and preparing for battle. It was a masterpiece of misdirection that saved countless real Italian lives and kept the Royal Navy guessing. The technical detail of the Taranto decoys was staggering. Italian engineers realized that a static decoy was an easy target for suspicion, so they added life to their wooden creations. They placed mannequins in sailor uniforms on the decks of the Plywood ships. They painted realistic rust and weathering onto the canvas sides. They even built fake cranes and supply trucks out of scrap metal and timber to surround the dummy ships. This created a complete ecosystem of deception. The British analysts were looking for activity metrics, the small signs that a base is operational. By faking these metrics, the Italians successfully diverted dozens of RAF raids away from their real fuel depots and ammunition dumps. Every bomb that fell into the empty sea or onto a plywood deck was a bomb that didn't hit a real battleship. However, this strategy required nerves of steel. The men who operated the decoy sites had to remain at their posts during bombings, firing small-caliber anti-aircraft guns to make the port look defended. They were the frontline soldiers of a paper war, tasked with being the most convincing targets in the world. Their success meant that even when the British eventually achieved their famous victory at Taranto, they spent a significant portion of their planning and intelligence resources fighting against ghosts. The Mediterranean War was, above all else, a war of convoys. For Italy, the survival of the North African campaign depended on getting supplies to Tripoli and Benghazi, but the British Force K out of Malta was a deadly predator, sinking Italian merchant ships at an alarming rate. To counter this, the Regia Marina began deploying ghost convoys. These were groups of small, low-value coastal vessels, or even barges, fitted with massive superstructures made of timber and sailcloth. From a distance, or through the periscope of a British submarine, these small boats looked like 10,000-ton troop transports. They were sent out on suicide routes, designed specifically to be spotted. The hope was that British submarines would spend their limited torpedoes on these cardboard giants, revealing their positions and leaving the real valuable supply ships to slip through the darkness on a different route. This was a cold, calculated sacrifice. The Italian sailors on these ghost ships knew they were bait. They sailed into the most dangerous waters in the world, protected by nothing but plywood, in the hope that the enemy's greed for a big kill would outweigh their caution. It was a desperate gamble that turned the Mediterranean into a graveyard of illusions. Submarine warfare is a game of mathematics and limited opportunities. A submarine commander has only a few torpedoes and a small window of time to strike before being detected. The Italian cardboard convoy strategy weaponized this limitation. By flooding the sea lanes with fake high-value targets, the Italians forced British commanders into a state of target saturation. Imagine the frustration of a British captain who, after days of stalking a convoy through heavy seas, fires his spread of torpedoes only to see his target shatter into wooden splinters instead of exploding in a ball of fire. These incidents weren't just tactical wins for the Italians, they were psychological blows to the Royal Navy. The Merchant of Ghosts became a legend in the Mediterranean. British intelligence began to doubt every report they received. Is it a battleship or a barge? Is it a troop ship or a timber frame? This doubt was exactly what the Italians wanted. It created a friction of war that slowed down British decision-making. Every hour a British commander spent verifying a target was an hour the real Italian supplies had to reach Rommel's Africa Corps. The cardboard fleet was proof that in war, the appearance of power can sometimes be just as effective as power itself, provided your enemy is convinced that what they see is real. As the war shifted deeper into the sands of North Africa, the Italian deception moved from the sea to the shore. The Regia Aeronautica and the army faced a relentless pounding from the British Desert Air Force. To survive, they created the Mirage cities. Using nothing but empty oil drums, scrap wood, and thousands of yards of burlap, Italian engineers constructed entire fake airfields and supply depots across the Cyrenaican desert. These were not mere sketches, they were three-dimensional masterpieces. They arranged old, unserviceable trucks in patterns that suggested a motorized division was refueling. They painted shadows on the sand to make flat pieces of wood look like deep trenches or fortified bunkers. To a British pilot flying at 200 miles per hour, these sites looked like the motherlode of targets. They would dive, screaming out of the sun, and unleash tons of high explosives into nothing, just sand and painted wood. The Italians would even place small flash charges in the fake depots that would detonate when hit, creating a spectacular but harmless secondary explosion to convince the British they had destroyed a vital fuel reserve. This was the ultimate poker game, where the Italians bluffed with an empty hand and the British folded by wasting their limited munitions on ghosts. The sheer scale of this desert theater of the absurd was breathtaking. At one point near Tobruk, the Italians maintained a fake hospital and barracks complex that occupied more space than the actual frontline positions. They understood the British obsession with aerial photography. Every morning, Italian soldiers would drive a single real truck in circles around the fake base to create fresh tire tracks in the sand, knowing the British would look for signs of recent activity on their reconnaissance photos. They even built cardboard tanks, the infamous M13-40 mock-ups, that were moved by hand on wooden rollers during the night. The British intelligence officers in Cairo would spend nights debating the movement of these ghost divisions, shifting their own tank brigades to counter a threat made of plywood and canvas. This deception didn't just save Italian equipment, it paralyzed British strategy. It created a fog of war so thick that the British commanders began to trust their eyes less and less, leading to a fatal hesitation. The desert mirage proved that in the vast emptiness of Africa, a well-placed shadow was worth more than a battalion of real soldiers. Night in the Mediterranean was a time of terror and opportunity. The British Royal Navy, equipped with early radar, felt they owned the darkness. To counter this, the Italians developed the Lucifer strategy, a complex system of decoy lighting. When the sirens wailed in a port like Genoa or Naples, the real harbor would go into a total suffocating blackout. But miles away, in a secluded and empty bay, the Italians would activate a series of floating lights and small fires. These lights were carefully calibrated to mimic the exact light signature of a battleship at anchor. The dim glow from a porthole, the masthead lights, and the flickering of a ship's galley. British bombers, guided by these lights, would drop their payloads into the deep water, thinking they had sent the pride of the Italian Navy to the bottom. This was a war of perceptions, where the Italians used the enemy's own technology against them. They knew the British pilots were exhausted and stressed, looking for any visual confirmation of a target. By providing a perfect target in the wrong place, the Italians ensured that the real fleet remained safe in the shadows, ready to strike another day. The psychological toll on the British pilots who fell for the glass battleships was immense. After returning to base and claiming a direct hit on a cruiser, they would be shown reconnaissance photos the next day, showing the real cruisers still afloat and the target bay completely empty. This created a sense of paranoia within the RAF. Commanders began to suspect their own men of lazy targeting, while the pilots grew resentful of the Italian magicians. The Italians even perfected the art of fake ship-to-ship signaling. They would place two men on a raft with a signal lamp, flashing coded messages in the darkness to mimic a destroyer communicating with its escort. To a British submarine commander watching through a periscope, this was the ultimate bait. He would fire his torpedoes at a lamp on a piece of wood, only to be hunted down by the real Italian destroyers that had been lurking in the darkness, waiting for him to reveal his position. The Mediterranean night became a hall of mirrors, where every light was a lie and every shadow was a potential death trap. The cardboard fleet had now moved from wood to light, proving that the most effective camouflage is the one that exists only in the mind of the enemy. By 1942, the Regia Aeronautica was struggling to replace its losses. The Italian aviation industry, while brilliant in design, could not match the assembly lines of the British or Americans. To maintain the illusion of numbers, the Italians deployed the Canvas Air Force. Across the airfields of Sicily and Sardinia, hundreds of dummy aircraft were lined up in perfect rows. These weren't just simple silhouettes, they were built with internal frames that allowed them to be moved and angled to catch the sun correctly. From a high-altitude reconnaissance Spitfire, these dummy Macchis and Savoia Marchettis looked like a massive strike force preparing to launch an attack on Malta. This forced the British to keep their own fighters on high alert, wasting fuel and wearing out engines to counter a threat that was made of old bed sheets and scrap timber. The canvas Air Force was so convincing that in several instances, British intelligence reported that the Italian air strength had doubled in a single week, causing panic in the Mediterranean Command and diverting entire carrier groups to reinforce the region. The management of these fake airfields was a full-time military operation. Decoy squadrons were formed, consisting of soldiers whose only job was to maintain the cardboard planes. They would move them every few hours to simulate taxiing. They would start small smoke pots nearby to simulate engines warming up, and they would even blast recorded engine noises through primitive loudspeakers to fool any spies lurking near the fences. This level of detail was essential because the British were not fools. They looked for telltale signs of reality. The Italians responded by creating fake oil leaks on the ground, using dark paint, and placing real, broken-down trucks around the dummy planes to simulate repair crews. This was an industrial-scale deception that turned every empty field in Italy into a potential threat. For the real Italian pilots, who were often flying outdated planes against superior numbers, the canvas Air Force provided a strange kind of protection. As long as the British were busy bombing the plywood decoys on the ground, the real pilots had a chance to scramble and fight. It was a desperate, creative, and remarkably effective way to fight a modern war with the resources of a theater company. The Littorio-class battleships were the pride of Italy. Massive, fast, and armed with 15-inch guns. They were the only ships the British truly feared. But as the war progressed, keeping these giants fueled and operational became an impossible task. To keep the fear alive, the Italians built a ghost Littorio. In a secluded shipyard near La Spezia, they constructed a full-scale replica of a battleship using a framework of steel pipes covered in painted canvas. This ship was so large and so detailed that it could be seen from miles away. The goal was to convince British intelligence that Italy had a fourth battleship in the class, a secret ship that didn't exist in any official records. For months, British agents and aerial photos confirmed the existence of this phantom vessel. The Royal Navy was forced to hold back 2 of its own battleships in the Mediterranean just to counter this non-existent threat. The ghost Littorio never fired a shot, but it successfully neutralized a significant portion of the British fleet simply by existing as a possibility in the mind of the Admiralty. The deception of the ghost Littorio was so successful that it highlights the greatest weakness of modern intelligence, the desire to find what you are looking for. The British expected the Italians to build more ships, so when they saw the ghost, they didn't question it. They categorized it. The Italians played on this bias perfectly. They would leak false documents through double agents, mentioning the secret battleship's name and its expected launch date. They even had sailors in the local bars talk about the new monster being built in the docks. This was multi-layered deception, combining visual, auditory, and document-based lies into a single, unbreakable narrative. When the British finally occupied La Spezia later in the war, they found the ghost, a pile of shredded canvas and rusted pipes. The realization that they had been outmaneuvered by a stage prop was a bitter pill for the British Naval Command. The ghost Littorio remains one of the most cost-effective naval units in history. For the price of a few thousand yards of canvas, it kept the most powerful navy in the world at bay for nearly a year. As the Allied air superiority became absolute, the Italians turned to a darker form of deception, the aluminum trap. They realized that the British were using advanced radar and electronic DF, direction finding, to hunt down Italian radio stations and radar units. In response, the Italians began building electronic ghosts. They took hundreds of rolls of aluminum foil, originally intended for food packaging, and draped them over wooden frames in the shape of radar antennas. These foil towers would catch the British radar pulses and bounce them back with such intensity that they appeared as high-value targets on the enemy screens. At the same time, they would set up low-power radio transmitters that broadcasted gibberish in Italian military code. The British, thinking they had found a major command center, would send in waves of bombers. They would drop their loads on a pile of kitchen foil and wood, while the real Italian command center remained silent and invisible just a few miles away. This was a sophisticated evolution of the cardboard fleet, moving from visual lies to electronic ones, proving that the Italian spirit of l'arte di arrangiarsi, the art of making do, was a potent weapon even in the age of high technology. The aluminum trap created a massive problem for Allied intelligence. Their screens were filled with ghost signals that made it impossible to tell where the real Italian units were. This led to information overload. British commanders were paralyzed by too much data, most of it false. They began to suspect that every signal they intercepted was a trap, leading them to ignore real intelligence that could have ended the campaign sooner. The Italians were playing a dangerous game of electronic hide-and-seek. They would move these foil decoys every night, creating a shifting landscape of false signals that the British had to map and analyze. This required thousands of man-hours of work from British analysts, all for nothing. The cardboard fleet had successfully moved into the electromagnetic spectrum. It was a testament to the Italian engineers' ability to innovate under extreme pressure. They didn't have the vacuum tubes or the complex circuits of the British, but they had the imagination to turn a roll of foil into a strategic decoy that protected their army from total annihilation. Malta was the thorn in the side of the Axis, a stationary aircraft carrier that strangled the supply lines to Africa. The Italians knew they had to block the island, but they didn't have the ships to maintain a 360-degree perimeter. Their solution was the Plywood blockade. They took hundreds of small fishing boats and motor launches and fitted them with massive wings made of dark canvas and wood. At dawn or dusk, when visibility was low, these small boats looked like a massive fleet of destroyers and torpedo boats patrolling the waters around Malta. The British pilots on the island would report heavy enemy activity, causing the commanders to cancel supply flights and sea sorties. This was a blockade of fear maintained by a handful of brave fishermen and a few tons of timber. For weeks at a time, the cardboard blockade successfully isolated Malta, not by sinking ships, but by convincing the British that any attempt to leave the harbor would be met by a superior naval force. The Plywood blockade was a masterpiece of economical warfare. The Italians were using 100 lira props to stop million-pound operations. The British eventually caught on, but only after they noticed that these destroyers never seemed to move very fast and never fired their guns even when approached. But by then, the damage was done. The delays caused by the Ghost Fleet allowed Rommel to receive the tanks he needed for his next offensive. The Italian sailors on these small boats were incredibly vulnerable. If a real British destroyer had appeared, they would have been shredded in seconds. But they relied on the psychological principle that an enemy will usually choose the safest path. The British didn't want to risk their few remaining planes on a gamble, so they stayed on the ground. This was the cardboard fleet's finest hour, a moment where the illusion of power was so perfect that it functioned exactly like real power. It proved that in the Mediterranean, a well-told lie was worth more than a poorly aimed shell. When the war finally ended and the masks were stripped away, the world was stunned by the extent of the Italian deception. The cardboard fleet was revealed for what it was, a desperate, brilliant, and deeply human effort to fight a war they were never industrially prepared to win. Thousands of kills claimed by the British and Americans were found to be nothing more than wooden splinters and torn canvas. The Italian paper lion had roared, and for 3 long years the British Empire had listened. The legacy of these deceptions is not one of cowardice, but of incredible ingenuity. The men who built and operated the cardboard fleet were the ultimate practitioners of asymmetric warfare. They used art to fight iron and imagination to fight industry. They proved that in the chaos of war, the greatest battlefield is the one between the enemy's ears. As the sun sets on the era of the great battleships, the story of the Italian decoys remains a haunting reminder that what we see is rarely the whole truth, especially when our survival depends on believing the lie. The cardboard fleet was the last grand performance of a nation that has always understood the power of the theater. The Italian sailors and engineers who created these ghosts didn't just save ships, they saved the honor of a navy that was asked to do the impossible with nothing. Their story is a silent chapter in the history of WW2, overshadowed by the massive industrial might of the USA or the grim determination of the USSR. But in the warm waters of the Mediterranean, the cardboard fleet left a permanent mark. It forced the world to realize that technology and steel are useless if they are directed at the wrong target. The Italian illusion remains a masterclass in the art of war, a proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon in the arsenal is a piece of wood, a bucket of paint, and the courage to stand behind a lie. The War of the Mediterranean was won by the Allies, but the War of the Imagination was won by the cardboard fleet, a ghost that still haunts the annals of naval history.